Before I begin, I wonder whether you would allow me just to say a few words about the recent terror attacks in Ankara last week, but also in November, and also the attack in Istanbul in January. As a member of the European Parliament for London, and someone who grew up with seeing terrorist attacks in our city and across the water in Ireland, and someone who was in Mumbai during the terror attacks in 2008, I think all of us can understand the horror of having to live through some of these abominations and these acts of terror. And let us just assure our hosts and everyone else that we need to be resolute, we need to show unity, and we need at this time to come together to defeat the terrorists. Yesterday I left Brussels as the Prime Ministers were gathering to discuss the migrant and refugee crisis that EU leaders have failed to resolve up to now. And it seems that in some ways that we are trying to contract our failures to Turkey. Now, whatever we feel about the deal that's been arrived at between the EU and Turkey, I think we should really pay tribute to the Turkish government, the authorities and the people for providing housing and sanctuary for 2.8 million Syrian and Iraqi refugees, making no distinction on the basis of faith, culture and creed. And we also understand that Turkey faces other challenges, including ISIS, Daesh, PKK and Assad, to name a few. But whatever our differences about many other issues, as the British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammonds indicated last week when he met the Turkish Foreign Minister, the international community stands with Turkey at this very difficult time. As the leader of the European Conservatives and Reformists movement, it is a huge pleasure to be here at the second Conservatives and Reformists Summit, following on from our very successful summit in Tunis last year. And just as I like to think of Tunis as a place where an uprising in favour of property rights began in 2010, I see Turkey as home to many people, dare I say friends, who see no inherent contradiction between Islam and liberty, whether it be Mustafa Akyol, author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, or Attila Yayla and his colleagues at the Association of Liberal Thinking, and I'm very pleased to see many of them here today. And these are two people and organisations that I've worked with over the past in the Istanbul Network for Liberty, a network of think tanks and individuals to explore the principles and the values of a free society in the Muslim world. I'm also very proud of the work carried out by my pan-European political party, the Alliance of European Conservatives and Reformists. We are the fastest growing and most successful of all the pan-European political movements. And I'm delighted to support the work that the AECR has been carrying out in Europe, North Africa and the Middle East, forging alliances with like-minded centre-right parties promoting moderate free market conservatism in parts of the world that badly needs it. And the principles that we advance, the rule of law, parliamentary supremacy, open markets, personal autonomy, sound money, lower taxes, civic patriotism, national sovereignty, secure property, they work wherever they are applied. Now, for many years, the commentators have marvelled at the Turkish economic story. It was an easy story to tell. Between 2002 and 2012, Turkey saw an average economic growth rate of 5%, a figure that peaked around 9% in 2010. In 2004, inflation fell into single figures for the first time in 30 years. Turkish universities soared up the international rankings, with 6 now placed in the top 200. And the World Bank estimated that over the past decade, per capita income nearly tripled to exceed $10,500. This was even more remarkable when set against a Turkey that at the beginning of the century was on the brink of an IMF emergency bailout amounting to billions. So in the years following the financial crisis, the international press was filled with stories of Turkey's success, and both delighted and bemused at the stark contrast with the rest of Europe. A 2005 Economist article paints this macroeconomic progress as, quote, running in tandem with sweeping political reforms, resulting in unprecedented political stability in the country. However, in recent years, the glowing reviews of both political and economic strength have diminished. There are concerns over stalled investment, a sluggish economy, and also clearly concerns over heavy-handed government and censorship. And the debate over internal freedoms, possible global economic downturn, the rise of terrorism, the effects of the Arab Spring, the situation in Syria, and the refugee crisis, quite a list, will certainly make the next few years challenging both politically and economically for Turkey. But I think we have to accept that on every continent and amongst all religions, you will find examples of success and failure. And the question has a particular sharpness, it seems to me, in several countries not far from here. Syria, Libya, Egypt, where we saw authoritarian regimes in the habit of justifying their dictatorship by presenting themselves as the sole alternatives to religious extremism. When repressive regimes use that argument, they run the risk of making it self-fulfilling. If people are told often enough that the only alternative to a brutal, self-serving tyranny is a form of Islamist extremism, they may actually start to believe it. The risk is thus of polarization. Secular generals on the one hand and religious fundamentalists on the other. Each side feeds on the fare of the others. Mainstream democratic parties end up being squeezed out, or else they are forced to take the side of one lot of autocrats for fare of the other. Now, Turkey, as I say, has been for many years seen to be a success story in a region that really needs success stories. The Turkish model was initially seen as a possible model for many countries after the Arab Spring. And there was huge hope that we would see the advent of democracies where political parties treat their opponents as fellow citizens with whom they disagree, not as enemies of the state. But there are plenty of people in this room who hope that Turkey can once again be a beacon for marrying Islam with political and economic reform. But I today really want to talk to you in broader terms as an elected European parliamentarian, as a British Conservative, and as someone who holds the faith of Islam to be very important in my life. But also, not least, as an enthusiastic free marketeer. It's often said that the British people are uncomfortable talking about religion, and it's true. It's as true of me as it is of any of my countrymen. When we had a Prime Minister who said that he wore his religion on his sleeve, he came in for lots of criticism. People thought that religion should remain in the private sphere. And I resist using my faith to ask fellow Muslims to vote for me. But equally, I've never sought to play down my faith in any way. I've fought all my elections, whether for local councils, for the London Assembly, for the House of Commons, for the European Parliament, as a British Conservative. I became leader of the European Conservative Reformists, now the third largest and by far the fastest growing group in the European Parliament, as a British Conservative. In fact, I know I'm probably the first non-Christian leader of any political group in the European Parliament. But does that mean that my politics are completely detached from my faith? Of course not. I'm conscious that I'm speaking to a room full of politicians. All of you know that your personal principles and your political principles are partly informed by your personal values. And those of you who have faith will try, I hope, to behave as if there is a higher law. All religions teach us the sanctity of life, truth and property. And I like to think that we are better politicians, just as I like to think we might be better people if we try not to lie, steal or hurt others, whether that is framed by having religion to give you a framework, or whether you're a humanist or you have some other higher principle. And that, to me, is what values mean. As I say, I am as diffident as any other Briton when it comes to discussing faith. So let me put it like this. I believe that in the end, we are all personally answerable to God for our actions. And I try to remember that sobering truth whenever I have to make choices, either in politics or in my personal life. I've always advised young, aspiring politicians who I like to bring through the ranks to be true to themselves. And for those of us who profess the faith, this means that whether we worship at a church, a synagogue, a temple, or a mosque, when we sit down and face our Maker, we have to be true to ourselves and to God. But the authority of God over man does not justify the authority of man over man. Virtue cannot be coerced. We must all make our own choices. The question I was once asked by a moral philosopher is, which is the most moral or more sincere faith? Is it the one when they hear the prayer to court on the Friday, who goes out of free will? Or is it the one who goes because everyone else goes and they are worried about seeming to be the odd one out? I say this as a Muslim, and I say it as a conservative. Free will is the highest faculty we have. And when it is denied, whether in the name of religious conformity or of state power, our humanity is diminished. And let me add that this is a particular challenge for those of us in this room, representing as we do, parties of the centre. We all know that the leftist parties in the region have problems of their own. The way in which many supposed liberals have backed unconstitutional coups or even violent repression because they happen to dislike the people being oppressed is shameful. But that, though, is a challenge for our friends on the left to address. Challenge is a different one. It is to rein in the tendency of some political movements in this region to think that after years of secular dictatorship, a measure of religious law is justified. That one form of coercion can now be compensated by a different form of coercion. The Sahifat al-Madina, or the Charter or Constitution of Medina, drafted by the Prophet Muhammad in 622, guaranteed certain freedoms for all its citizens, regardless of their faiths. So that the original Ummah that many people talk about now was not just an Ummah of Muslims, it was an Ummah for all faiths. So in fact, the answer to secular dictatorship is not a religious dictatorship. It is an open society in which freedom of worship is accepted, along with freedom of speech, assembly and contract. You don't become a better Muslim by demanding religious laws or privileges. You become a better Muslim, with God's help, by improving your own behaviour, that internal jihad, the one struggle to live a good life with all the external temptations. And should I tell you something? We all know that is by far the harder path. The state does not have a collective identity. It can't be devout or charitable or honest as individuals and families can be. It can only provide a context with institutions in which individual citizens can pursue those virtues. Charity means giving to or working for those who need help. It doesn't mean hypothecating taxes or decreeing higher taxes to help those organisations. In the same way, to pick an example, more or less at random, observing the dietary laws laid out in the sacred texts is a choice we can make every day. But changing the law to restrict the trade in alcohol or other commodities considered haram is not an act of piety, it's an act of compulsion. Islam arguably places more emphasis than the other great Abrahamic religions on personal responsibility. This is perhaps why, in its golden years, the Islamic world was also the centre of global commerce. Long before modern capitalism, as Dan says, emerged in northern Italian city-states and then in Holland and in England, secure property rights made Muslims rich and free. And I look forward to the presentation from Benedict Kohler later on some of the amazing things he says in his book. That actually means many of us as Muslims need to rediscover our own faith and our own history rather than relying on what contemporary teachers might tell us. Now that's a vision that surely ought to inspire our sister parties around this region, those who consider themselves conservatives. If you look to the Arab world, great damage has been done to Arab countries by two sets of authoritarians. Those who want to impose religion by force, and those of the Nasserite or Ba'athist tradition who want to impose socialism by force. But conservatives, we should not want to impose anything. We should trust to the sound judgment of people. We understand that the rational pursuit of self-interest under the law will, other things being equal, create a free and prosperous society. In fact, why is it that the freest societies are the most prosperous societies, and the most prosperous societies are the freest societies? Our task as legislators is to ensure that there is space for this process to unfold, to ensure that the state enables enterprise but does not crowd it out, that it secures property rights without encroaching on the private sector, that the law remains a mechanism for individuals seeking justice, not an instrument of state control. Our job is to roll the rocks away so that the grass can grow. This is the great task that faces emerging centre-right movements, not only across this region, but also, let's be honest, in my own region, in Europe, and more established centre-right movement here in Turkey. As I say, it's not so very different from the challenge that we face in the EU on almost a daily basis. But friends, let's tackle that together, as allies. But let us, as friends, not be afraid to be honest with each other when we feel that we are straying from the principles that we all hold dear. Freedom of press, the rule of law, parliamentary supremacy, open markets, personal autonomy, sound money, lower taxes, national sovereignty, and secure property. Those are values we should all hold dear, and we should all adhere to, even in difficult times when our security is challenged. Thank you.